A millionaire was shocked when his daughter's nanny said, "Sir, your daughter is not paralyzed. I know how to cure her." When the millionaire refused to listen to her, what the maid did left him in shock. The yellowish light from the desk lamp illuminated the piles of documents scattered across the small, worn wooden table. Michael, a 25-year-old young man with messy brown hair and determined dark eyes, was frantically typing on his old laptop, his fingers dancing over the keys with the urgency of someone whose dreams were bigger than his circumstances. His angular face showed signs of fatigue, but his eyes shone with the ambition of someone who knew that each document, each contract, each spreadsheet was a step toward the future he had planned for himself and Elizabeth. The walls of the small improvised office in the two-bedroom apartment were decorated only with a few framed certificates and a photo of the couple smiling, her hand resting on her already rounded belly. The clock on the wall showed it was almost midnight when Michael finally allowed himself to stretch his aching back, looking through the narrow window that faced the poorly lit street of the neighborhood where they lived. "A few more hours and this contract will be ready. Elizabeth will be proud when she learns I managed to close the deal with the construction company," thought Michael with a tired smile. The sound of dragging footsteps in the hallway made Michael raise his head from the papers. Elizabeth appeared at the office door, a 23-year-old woman with long black hair falling over her shoulders, her normally sweet face now contorted in an expression of pain. She was holding her belly with both hands, her light blue cotton dress highlighting the 7 months of pregnancy she had been carrying with increasing difficulty in recent weeks. Her legs trembled slightly as she leaned against the doorframe, breathing in a broken manner, her moist brown eyes reflecting a fear that Michael had never seen before. Beads of sweat formed on her forehead, and she tried to control her breathing as they had learned in their childbirth preparation classes. But something was different. Something was wrong. The contraction that hit her at that moment was so intense that she bent forward, a moan escaping her lips despite all efforts to remain calm. "Michael, something's wrong. It's not supposed to be now," she cried, doubling over in pain. "What are you feeling, my love? We still have 2 months until the due date," Michael responded, jumping from his chair. Michael leaped from the chair so quickly that he knocked some papers to the floor, rushing to Elizabeth and wrapping his arms around her. He could feel her body trembling, and when he looked into her eyes, he saw the panic she was trying to hide. His hands moved instinctively to her belly, where he could feel the contracted and tense muscles, completely different from the practice contractions she had felt in previous weeks. The apartment, which moments before had seemed cozy despite being simple, now felt too small, suffocating, as if the walls were closing in on them. Michael tried to stay calm, remembering everything they had read about premature labor, but the expression on Elizabeth's face said this was much more serious than anything the books had described. He helped her sit in the chair while he observed a bloodstain beginning to form on her dress, which made his heart race in panic. With quick but careful movements, he grabbed the car keys and the hospital bag that had been prepared for weeks. "We're going to the hospital right now. We won't wait another minute," Michael said with determination. "Michael, I'm scared. What if something happens to our baby?" Elizabeth whispered through her tears. The race to the hospital was a haze of blurred lights and distant sirens. Michael drove his used car with desperate precision, one hand on the wheel and the other holding Elizabeth's hand, who moaned softly with each contraction that became more intense and frequent. The city streets seemed endless that early morning, each red light an eternity, each turn an obstacle between them and the help Elizabeth urgently needed. She squeezed his hand with a strength he didn't know she possessed, her eyes closed as she tried to control the pain that swept through her body in increasingly violent waves. Michael could hear his own broken breathing mixed with her moans, and for the first time in his adult life, he felt completely helpless, unable to protect the person he loved most in the world. The hospital finally appeared before them, its illuminated windows like a beacon in the darkness, and Michael parked haphazardly before running to help Elizabeth out of the car. She could barely stand, and he carried her in his arms to the emergency entrance, shouting for help even before crossing through the automatic doors. "Please, someone help us. My fiancée is in premature labor," Michael shouted desperately. "Sir, you need to stay calm. We'll take care of her right now," a nurse responded, rushing with the stretcher. The hospital transformed into a whirlwind of activity as soon as Michael carried Elizabeth through the emergency door. Nurses appeared with a stretcher, moving with the efficiency of those who dealt with emergencies every day. But Michael could see the concern on their faces as they observed Elizabeth's condition. She was quickly transferred to the stretcher, her dark hair spread across the white pillow, her pale face contrasting with the fabric. Questions came from all sides as they rushed through the corridors. How many weeks of gestation? If it was the first pregnancy? If she had any known health problems? Michael tried to answer everything while running alongside the stretcher, his trembling voice betraying the fear he was trying to hide. 7 months of pregnancy. It's our first daughter. She's always been healthy. The double doors of the delivery room opened like a final barrier, and a middle-aged nurse with grey hair and kind but firm eyes prevented him from going further. The corridor on the other side of those doors seemed like a different world, a place where Michael couldn't protect Elizabeth, where everything depended on the hands of strangers and the will of forces greater than him. "Sir, you need to wait out here while we take care of your fiancée," the nurse said firmly. "But I want to stay with her. She needs me by her side at this moment," Michael protested, trying to pass through the human barrier. The hours that followed were the longest of Michael's life. He paced back and forth in the narrow hospital corridor, his steps echoing in the silence of dawn, interrupted only by the distant sounds of medical equipment and muffled voices coming from closed rooms. His hands trembled as he tried to drink the cold coffee from the machine, the bitter liquid making his stomach churn, but he needed something to occupy his hands that wouldn't stop sweating. Every few minutes he approached the double doors, trying to hear any sound that would give him a clue about what was happening on the other side. But what he heard made his heart contract with anguish. Elizabeth's screams of pain penetrated the walls, each one like a blade through his chest, reminding him that the woman he loved was suffering, and he could do absolutely nothing to help her. Other patients and family members passed through the corridor, some casting understanding glances at the visibly desperate young man who couldn't stay still. Michael felt as if he were living a nightmare from which he couldn't wake up, where each second stretched like an eternity. "Please, God, protect Elizabeth and our baby." "They are all I have in this world," Michael murmured, kneeling in the empty corridor. "I promise I'll be the best father and husband. Just let them be okay," he completed in a desperate prayer. When the screams finally ceased, an even more terrifying silence took over the corridor. Michael stopped pacing, his entire body tense like a rope about to break, his ears attentive to any sound that might indicate what had happened. Minutes passed like hours until the double doors finally opened, revealing a middle-aged doctor with grey hair and a grave expression, the blood-stained coat making Michael's heart sink. The doctor approached slowly, his hands behind his back, his gaze avoiding Michael's for a few seconds that seemed eternal. The way he took a deep breath before speaking told Michael everything he needed to know, but even so, he refused to accept what his instincts had already understood. The hospital corridor, with its white walls and fluorescent lights, suddenly seemed to narrow around him, as if the entire world was contracting until only he and the words the doctor was about to pronounce remained. Michael could hear his own heart beating in his ears, a desperate rhythm that seemed to want to escape his chest before reality hit him head-on. "Doctor, tell me they're okay. Please tell me my family is safe," Michael begged with a trembling voice. "I'm sorry we couldn't save her, but the baby survived," the doctor responded with regret. Michael's world collapsed in a matter of seconds. The doctor's words echoed in his mind like a distorted echo, each syllable repeating indefinitely as he tried to process what he had just heard. His legs failed, and he leaned against the wall to avoid falling, feeling as if all the air had been sucked from his lungs. The woman he loved, with whom he had planned every detail of his future, with whom he had dreamed of building a family and growing old together, was no longer there. The apartment they shared, the plans they had made, the names they had chosen for the baby, all of this was now stained by Elizabeth's irreversible absence. The doctor continued talking about complications during childbirth, about how they had done everything they could, but Michael couldn't focus on the words. His mind was stuck on the last image he had of Elizabeth, smiling at him at the office door before everything started. Tears began to roll down his face, but he barely felt them, lost in a whirlwind of pain and disbelief. When the doctor mentioned that the baby was healthy, and asked if he wanted to see her, Michael could only nod, unable to form words. "How will I raise our daughter alone, Elizabeth? How will I explain to her that her mother won't be there?" Michael thought in desperation. "This baby is all that's left of us. I need to be strong for her now," he concluded, trying to find strength. When they placed Sophie in his arms for the first time, Michael felt as if a part of Elizabeth had come back to life. The baby was small, more fragile than she would have been if she had been born on time, but perfect in every detail, with dark hair like her mother's and the same brown eyes that had won his heart years before. She was wrapped in a soft pink blanket, her tiny fingers moving slowly as she slept, oblivious to the tragedy that had marked her arrival into the world. Michael held her against his chest, feeling her small and fragile warmth against his skin, and for the first time since the doctor had given the terrible news, he was able to breathe again. The tears falling from his eyes now were different, a mixture of deep pain for the loss of Elizabeth and an instant, overwhelming love for that child who would depend completely on him. He could see Elizabeth in the shape of Sophie's eyes, in the way she frowned even while sleeping, and knew in that moment that he would carry the responsibility of keeping alive the memory of the woman he loved through the daughter they had created together. The hospital around him faded away, with only him and Sophie existing in that sacred moment where a father was born amidst tragedy. "Hi, Sophie. I'm your daddy, and even though your mommy can't be here, I'm going to love you for both of us," Michael whispered tenderly. "You are the greatest gift Elizabeth could have left me, my little princess," he added, gently kissing the baby's forehead. The days that followed passed in a haze of arrangements and pain. Michael had to organize Elizabeth's funeral while caring for a newborn, alternating between moments of pure exhaustion and bursts of adrenaline that kept him functioning when all he wanted was to surrender to grief. Friends and distant relatives appeared to offer condolences and help, but Michael felt completely alone in his pain, as if no one could really understand the magnitude of what he had lost. He spent nights awake watching Sophie sleep in the crib they had assembled with such care just a few weeks earlier, imagining how different it would be if Elizabeth were there to share the night shifts and marvel at each small movement of their daughter. The apartment, once full of life and hope, now echoed with the silence of absence, broken only by Sophie's occasional cry asking for food or affection. Michael quickly learned to change diapers, prepare bottles, and interpret the different types of his daughter's cries. But each task was a painful reminder that he should be doing all of this alongside Elizabeth. On the eve of the funeral, he held Sophie in his arms while looking at Elizabeth's photo on the living room table, silently promising that he would honor her memory by being the best possible father. "Elizabeth, I know you're watching me. I'll make our daughter know how much you loved her," Michael murmured, looking at the photo. "Every day that I care for her will be a way to keep you alive in our hearts," he promised with a choked voice. The day of the funeral dawned grey and cold, as if the sky itself was mourning Elizabeth. Michael wore his only black suit, the same one he had worn on the day he proposed to Elizabeth, and held Sophie in his arms throughout the ceremony. The church was full of people who had known and loved Elizabeth, their faces reflecting the same pain that Michael felt in his chest, but he could barely concentrate on the priest's words or the friends' speeches. His attention was divided between the memories passing like a movie in his mind and the responsibility of caring for Sophie, who slept peacefully in his arms, unaware of the solemnity of the moment. When his turn to speak came, Michael approached the pulpit with trembling legs, looking at the dark wooden coffin where the body of the woman who had been his entire life rested. The words came from his heart, not from the script he had prepared the night before, each phrase carrying such intense emotion that it made many of those present cry along with him. He spoke about Elizabeth's love for life, about the dreams they had shared, about how she had sacrificed herself to bring Sophie into the world, and about the promise he was making at that moment in front of everyone. "I promise you, my love, that our daughter will have everything you dreamed for her. I will build an empire just for our Sophie," Michael declared from the pulpit. "She will grow up knowing how much you loved her, even without having had the chance to meet you," he added with tears in his eyes. After the funeral, when all the guests had finally left and Michael found himself alone in the apartment with Sophie, he felt the full weight of his new reality fall upon his shoulders. The house was full of flowers and condolence cards, physical reminders of the loss that still seemed unreal, but it was also filled with the silence that would be his companion from then on. He placed Sophie in the crib and sat in the chair beside it, watching her sleep while mentally planning the future he would have to build for her alone. All the dreams he had shared with Elizabeth had now transformed into responsibilities he would carry only in his name, but also in the name of the woman he had lost. Michael knew he couldn't afford to give himself completely to grief. There was a small daughter depending on him, and this dependence gave him a purpose that kept him functioning even in the darkest moments. He took a notebook and began to write new plans, more aggressive business strategies, more ambitious financial goals, all designed to give Sophie a life that would somehow compensate for the fact that she would grow up without a mother. That night, as he rocked Sophie to sleep, Michael made whispered promises that only she and the walls of the apartment could hear. "Sophie, my little one, Daddy will work day and night for you to have everything in life," Michael whispered in the silence of the room. "You will be the most loved and protected girl in the world. I promise this with my life," he completed, gently rocking her. Looking at Sophie at that moment, with her fine silk-like hair and soft baby breath, Michael felt a determination grow inside him like he had never felt before. She represented not only his future, but also the continuation of the love he and Elizabeth had shared, living proof that something beautiful could emerge even from the greatest tragedy. He held her a little tighter, careful not to wake her, and whispered the words that would become his mantra for the years to come, a promise that would shape every decision he would make from that day forward. The moon illuminated the room through the half-open curtain, creating an almost magical atmosphere around father and daughter, as if Elizabeth were there blessing the moment and approving the words Michael was about to pronounce. He could feel her presence somehow, a warm sensation that enveloped him when he looked into Sophie's brown eyes, which opened for a brief moment before closing again in deep sleep. At that instant, Michael knew his life had changed forever, and that every breath from then on would be dedicated to honoring Elizabeth's memory through unconditional love for Sophie. "Daddy will make you the happiest girl in the world no matter what happens," Michael murmured with determination. "This is my promise to you and your mother, my little Sophie. Our journey is just beginning," he concluded, sealing the sacred pact between father and daughter. 8 years had passed since that fateful night at the hospital, and Michael had fulfilled every word of the promise made to Elizabeth and little Sophie. The empire he had dreamed of building now stretched before his eyes as a tangible reality. Construction companies spread throughout the country, investments in technology that yielded millions monthly, and a fortune that grew exponentially each quarter. At 33, Michael had become one of the most respected and feared businessmen in the market, known for his relentless determination and his ability to turn any business into gold. His black hair now had a few silver strands at the temples, the result not only of age, but of sleepless nights dedicated to closing deals and expanding his businesses, always with Sophie's smiling face in a photo on his desk as constant motivation. On that sunny morning, wearing an impeccably tailored Italian suit and leather shoes that cost more than many people earned in a year, Michael drove his sports car along the winding roads leading to the private horse farm he had bought for Sophie. The wind hit his face through the open sunroof as he thought about how generous life had been to him in recent years, allowing him to give his daughter everything a child could dream of and much more. "Sophie will be radiant when she finds out I bought that Arabian horse she so admired at the last auction," Michael thought, accelerating down the private road. "Every penny I earn is worth it when I see her smile lighting up the world around me." Michael's private horse farm was a 50-hectare property that resembled a piece of paradise on earth, with verdant pastures extending as far as the eye could see, surrounded by perfectly aligned white fences that gleamed under the morning sun. Noble wooden stables housed some of the most expensive and well-trained horses in the country, each personally chosen by Michael, based not only on their lineage, but on their gentle temperament suitable for a child. The main house on the farm, an elegant 2-story building with spacious verandas and meticulously maintained gardens, served as a weekend retreat for father and daughter, a place where Michael could temporarily forget the pressures of business and devote himself entirely to Sophie's happiness. Uniformed staff took care of every detail of the property, from horse handlers to gardeners, who kept the flowers always perfect, all instructed to ensure Sophie had the safest and most enjoyable experience possible on each visit. When Michael parked in front of the main stable, he could hear Sophie's crystalline laughter echoing across the fields, a sound that immediately warmed his heart and brought a genuine smile to his normally serious face. He got out of the car, adjusting his shirt cuffs and walking toward the sound of his daughter's happiness, knowing that the next moments would be the most precious of his week. There is no more beautiful sound in the world than my Sophie's laughter echoing across these fields, Michael murmured to himself. For moments like this, all the sacrifices and sleepless nights were worth every second. Sophie appeared riding Storm, a dark brown thoroughbred horse that Michael had bought especially for her 2 years earlier, when the 8-year-old girl had demonstrated a natural talent for horsemanship that impressed even the most experienced instructors. She was an extraordinarily beautiful child, with Elizabeth's long black hair dancing in the wind and bright brown eyes full of intelligence and joy that made Michael's heart tighten with emotion every time he looked at her. Dressed in the finest quality riding gear, beige riding pants, brown leather boots, and a navy blue safety helmet decorated with gold stars that she had personally chosen, Sophie looked like a little princess from a fairy tale, completely in her natural element on horseback. Her radiant smile when she saw Michael approaching was contagious, and she waved energetically with one hand while controlling the reins with the other, demonstrating a skill that grew with each week of training. Michael stopped near the white wooden fence that bordered the training track, resting his arms on the fence and watching with paternal pride as Sophie confidently and elegantly guided Storm, their movements synchronized as if they were a single entity. The riding instructor, an experienced 50-year-old man who had worked with horses for decades, carefully observed Sophie's every movement, ready to intervene if necessary, but clearly impressed with the girl's natural abilities. "Daddy, look how fast I am today. Storm and I are a perfect team," shouted Sophie, making the horse trot in perfect circles. "Can you see how he obeys my every command? We're like best friends who understand each other without needing words." The pride that Michael felt at that moment was almost palpable, a warm sensation that spread through his chest as he watched Sophie demonstrate not only her equestrian skills, but also the confidence and determination she had inherited from him. Each movement of hers on the horse was executed with a natural grace that made clear how much she loved that sport, and Michael couldn't help but smile, seeing how her eyes shone with pure and genuine happiness. During all those years of hard work and sacrifices, moments like that gave meaning to everything, living proof that every difficult decision, every night spent in closed offices, every risky business had been worth it to provide Sophie with a childhood full of joy and opportunities he had never had. The horse farm, the horses, the private lessons, all of this was more than luxury. It was the materialization of the unconditional love he felt for his daughter and the promise he had made to Elizabeth on the day of the funeral. Michael took his cell phone from his pocket and started filming Sophie, capturing every second of that perfect moment to keep forever in his memory and to show her when she was older how she was an extraordinary horsewoman since she was little. He could imagine Elizabeth smiling from heaven, seeing how the daughter she had so much wanted to meet had grown to become a brave and talented girl, exactly as she had dreamed. "Sophie, you're riding like a true champion. Your mother would be so proud to see the strong woman you're becoming," Michael shouted, unable to contain the emotion in his voice. "Keep it up, my princess, and soon you'll be competing in the best tournaments in the country." It was then that Sophie decided to show her father something new she had learned with the instructor the week before, a more advanced maneuver that involved making Tempest accelerate in a straight line and then perform a sudden stop followed by an elegant spin. The instructor had warned that she still needed a few more weeks of practice before attempting that maneuver without direct supervision, but Sophie was too confident in her own abilities and eager to impress Michael after seeing him arrive at the horse farm. She positioned Tempest at the beginning of the longest track, adjusted her position in the saddle, and took a deep breath, feeling the excitement grow in her chest as she prepared to accelerate. The horse, sensing the tension and expectation of its young rider, began to fidget slightly, moving its head up and down and tapping one of its front hooves on the ground in anticipation. Sophie held the reins firmly, leaned slightly forward, and gave the command for Tempest to accelerate, immediately feeling the powerful response of the animal that shot off down the track. The sensation of speed was electrifying, the wind hitting her face and making her long hair fly back, as she and Tempest ran as if they were a single mythical creature crossing the fields. Michael watched with a mixture of pride and growing concern, noting that Sophie was going faster than was safe for someone of her age and experience, but at the same time admiring the courage and determination she showed. "Sophie, slow down a bit. You don't need to prove anything to me. I already know you're the best horsewoman in the world," Michael shouted, trying to keep a cheerful tone, but beginning to feel a pang of anxiety. "You're already perfect the way you are, my daughter. You don't need to take risks to make me proud." The noise came out of nowhere, a deafening thunder that echoed across the fields like an artificial thunderclap, making everyone present jump in fright and look around trying to identify the source of the sound. One of the handlers had accidentally dropped a pile of metal feed buckets near the main stable, creating a metallic and strident noise that spread through the air like an alarm siren. For the humans present, it was just a momentary scare. But for Tempest, who was galloping at high speed with Sophie on his back, the sound was interpreted as a sign of mortal danger that activated all his primitive flight instincts. The horse reared violently, its front legs rising in the air while a neigh of terror escaped from its throat, its muscular body writhing in total panic. Sophie, who wasn't prepared for such an extreme reaction, immediately felt that she had lost control of the situation, her small hands struggling to hold the reins that suddenly seemed to have a life of their own. The world around her transformed into a chaos of movement and terror, with Tempest spinning and jumping unpredictably while trying to get rid of what it perceived as a threat. For a few seconds that seemed eternal, Sophie managed to stay in the saddle, her experience and training helping her maintain balance, even with the horse behaving completely erratically. But when Storm made a sudden sideways movement followed by another rear, it was too much force for an 8-year-old to control. "Daddy, I can't stop him. Storm is too scared and isn't listening to me," Sophie cried in desperation, her small hands slipping on the sweat-soaked reins. "Help me, Daddy. I don't know what to do when he gets like this." The fall happened in slow motion in Michael's perception, each second stretching like a cruel eternity, as he watched helplessly as his daughter was thrown from Storm's back with a brutal force that sent her flying through the air before hitting the hard ground of the track with an impact that made everyone present hold their breath. The sound of Sophie's small body hitting the earth was followed by an absolute and terrifying silence, as if the world itself had stopped breathing in that moment. Michael jumped over the wooden fence with an agility he didn't know he possessed, running toward his daughter, with his heart racing in total panic, his desperate cries echoing across the fields as he approached the spot where Sophie lay motionless. The instructor also ran, arriving almost at the same time as Michael, and together they knelt beside the girl, who was conscious but clearly in shock, her brown eyes wide with pain and confusion. Michael could immediately see that something was terribly wrong. Sophie was trying to move, but her legs weren't responding, remaining inert on the ground as she looked at them with an expression of growing incomprehension. Tears began to roll down her face, not just from the physical pain she felt in her back, but from the primal fear of not being able to get up as she always did after any fall. Michael held her hand carefully, trying to stay calm so as not to frighten her further, but internally his world was collapsing again, exactly as it had happened 8 years before in that hospital corridor. "Daddy, I can't feel my legs." "Why aren't they moving when I tell them to?" Sophie whispered in a trembling voice, looking at Michael with eyes full of tears and fear. "This is normal after a fall, isn't it? In a little while I'll be able to get up and ride Storm again, right?" The trip to the hospital was a cruel repetition of the nightmare Michael had lived through 8 years before, but this time he was beside the stretcher, holding Sophie's small hand as the ambulance cut through traffic with sirens blaring toward the best private hospital in the city. Sophie remained conscious throughout the journey, asking questions that broke Michael's heart and trying to move her legs that remained completely inert under the thin ambulance blanket. The paramedic performed basic neurological tests, asking Sophie to try to move her toes and to feel when he touched her legs, but the results were consistently negative, each failed test adding more weight to the growing terror Michael felt in his chest. He maintained a forced smile on his face to reassure Sophie, whispering words of encouragement and promising that the doctors at the hospital would quickly fix everything. But internally, he was reliving the most traumatic moment of his life and fearing that history was repeating itself in a different but equally devastating way. The hospital appeared before them like a fortress of hope, its windows gleaming under the afternoon sun, and Michael muttered a silent prayer to any higher power that might be listening, begging that his daughter be spared from a tragedy that would change her life forever. When the ambulance doors opened, Michael got out first and then helped the paramedics carry the stretcher with Sophie, walking alongside her through the hospital corridors as nurses and doctors approached to take over the case. "Sophie, my love, the best doctors in the world are here to take care of you," Michael said, squeezing her hand carefully. "Daddy will be here the whole time, and when you get out of here, we'll buy 10 new horses for you to choose which one you prefer." The hours that followed were filled with an endless series of examinations, X-rays, MRIs, and consultations with specialists who came and went from the examination rooms with increasingly grave expressions. Michael waited in the familiar corridor, the same type of corridor where he had waited for news about Elizabeth years before, but this time he wasn't alone. Doctors regularly came to give updates on the progress of the examinations, although none of them wanted to give definitive opinions until all the results were complete. Sophie was lightly sedated for some of the more uncomfortable exams, and during these moments, Michael would observe her serene face through the windows of the examination rooms, remembering how small and fragile she was when she was born prematurely, and how she had fought to survive in those difficult early days. The cruel irony of the situation did not escape him. He had built an empire to protect Sophie from anything that could hurt her, but he had failed to protect her from an accident that happened right before his eyes, on a property he had purchased specifically to ensure her safety. Phones constantly rang in his pockets with calls from assistants, partners, and important clients, but Michael ignored all of them, his attention completely focused on his daughter's situation. When finally the chief doctor of the neurological team approached him in the hallway, Michael could read the verdict on the man's face before he even opened his mouth. "Dr. Williams, tell me my daughter will be all right, that this is just a temporary scare," Michael begged, preparing himself to hear words that would change his life forever. "I have the best health insurance in the country. I can pay for any experimental treatment that exists." Dr. Williams was a 60-year-old man with completely white hair and kind blue eyes that had seen much suffering throughout decades of medicine, but still maintained the compassion necessary to deliver difficult news with the delicacy that families deserved. He sat down next to Michael on the waiting bench, a gesture that immediately signaled the seriousness of the situation, and took a deep breath before beginning to explain the test results in a way that would be understandable to a layperson, but without hiding the real gravity of the diagnosis. The words came out of his mouth with the clinical precision of someone who had given the same type of news hundreds of times, but with the gentleness of someone who understood the devastating impact they would have on Michael and Sophie's lives. The imaging scans showed an injury to the spinal cord at the level of the second lumbar vertebra, a critical area that controlled movement and sensation in the legs, and neurological tests confirmed that the injury had resulted in complete paralysis of the lower limbs. The doctor explained that, although medicine had advanced significantly in treating spinal cord injuries, the specific type of trauma that Sophie had suffered had resulted in permanent damage that could not be reversed with current medical technology. Michael heard each word as if they were blades cutting his heart, but forced himself to maintain composure in order to ask the right questions and fully understand what the future held for his daughter. "Mr. Michael, your daughter has suffered a spinal cord injury that has resulted in paralysis of the lower limbs," Dr. Williams explained in a calm but direct voice. "She will no longer be able to walk, but with proper treatment, she can lead a full and productive life in many other aspects." Michael's world collapsed for the second time in his adult life, but this time in a different way. It wasn't the total and irreversible loss he had experienced with Elizabeth, but rather the permanent transformation of the life of the person he loved most in the world. He rose abruptly from the bench, beginning to pace back and forth in the corridor while processing the information, his hands trembling as he tried to comprehend how this could have happened, despite all the care and precautions he had taken. The money he had accumulated over the years, which had always been his weapon against any problem that might arise, suddenly seemed completely useless in the face of a situation that could not be resolved with checks or investments. He stopped in front of Dr. Williams, eyes moist but still full of the determination that had made him successful in business, and began to talk about experimental treatments, cutting-edge surgeries, international specialists, anything that might offer hope of reversing the diagnosis. His voice was urgent and desperate, but still maintained the authority of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted through persistence and financial resources, as if he could negotiate with fate in the same way he negotiated business contracts. The doctor patiently listened to all of Michael's proposals, recognizing the stage of denial that many parents went through when receiving devastating news about their children, but knew that his responsibility was to keep Michael anchored in medical reality, however painful it might be. "Doctor, I have money. I can pay for any experimental treatment that exists in the world," Michael declared vehemently, gesturing as he spoke. "There are stem cell surgeries, gene therapies. Surely there must be something medicine can do for an 8-year-old child." Dr. Williams' response was gentle but unyielding, supported by decades of medical experience and scientific knowledge that could not be altered by will or financial resources. He explained that, while it was understandable and natural that Michael would want to explore all possible options, the medical reality was that complete spinal cord injuries like the one Sophie had suffered had no known cure with current medicine, and subjecting a child to unproven experimental treatments could cause more suffering without any real benefit. The doctor had seen many wealthy families spend fortunes on unproven treatments around the world, returning not only without improvement, but often with additional complications and even greater emotional debts. His ethical responsibility was to guide Michael toward acceptance and focus on rehabilitation and adaptation, processes that, although they would not restore Sophie's ability to walk, could ensure that she lived a full and happy life despite her disability. The silence that followed the doctor's words was heavy with emotional weight, with Michael finally beginning to process the permanence of the situation and what it would mean for the future he had so carefully planned for Sophie. The hospital corridor, with its fluorescent lights and white walls, suddenly seemed cold and hostile, a place where dreams came to die and brutal realities were delivered in controlled doses by well-intentioned professionals. "I'm sorry, Mr. Michael, but some damage is irreversible, even with all the resources in the world," Dr. Williams said with genuine compassion. "What I can offer is hope that Sophie will adapt well and have a rich and meaningful life, just in a different way than you imagined." The months following the accident were the most difficult in Michael's life since Elizabeth's death, filled with a routine of medical appointments, physical therapy sessions, architectural adaptations to the house and office, and, most challenging of all, helping Sophie adapt to her new reality. The house that had been designed for an active and adventurous child had to be completely redesigned with ramps, support bars, adapted bathrooms, and elevators to ensure that Sophie could move independently through all rooms. Michael hired the best physical therapists and occupational therapists in the country, transformed one of the bedrooms into a complete rehabilitation room, and made sure to be present at each therapy session to learn how he could help Sophie at home. The customized wheelchair he had ordered for her was a work of art in itself. Lightweight, maneuverable, decorated with Sophie's favorite colors and equipped with all the adaptations that could facilitate her daily life. But despite all the resources and first-class medical care, Michael watched with a broken heart as Sophie struggled not only with the physical limitations of her new condition, but also with the emotional frustration of not being able to do simple things that were once automatic. That particular afternoon, Michael was working in his home office when he heard Sophie calling for help from the playroom, a sound that always made his stomach tighten with anguish, because it represented another reminder of the independence she had lost. "Daddy, can you come here, please? I can't reach my favorite book on the high shelf," Sophie asked with resignation in her voice. "I used to be able to reach anything, and now I need help even for the simplest things." When Michael entered the playroom, he found Sophie positioned in her wheelchair in front of the bookshelf, trying unsuccessfully to reach a volume that was just a few centimeters above her maximum reach. She had tried various strategies, stretching her arm as far as possible, leaning forward in her chair, even trying to use a ruler to knock the book down. But nothing had worked, and the frustration was visible in every line of her face. Michael quickly approached and got the book for her, but he could see that Sophie wasn't just upset about not being able to reach the object. She was upset by another confirmation that her life had changed in ways she was still learning to accept. She politely thanked him when he handed her the book, but Michael could see tears forming in her eyes, a mixture of gratitude and sadness that broke his heart. In recent months, he had observed Sophie go through all the stages of grief over the loss of her mobility, denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and now she seemed to be slowly walking toward acceptance. But there were still days like this one when reality hit her in a particularly painful way. Michael knelt beside her chair, placing his hand gently on her shoulder, and they talked about how she was feeling, a conversation they had had many times in recent months, but one that always seemed necessary and therapeutic for both. He knew that, as much as he loved Sophie and wanted to protect her from any suffering, there were aspects of her new journey that she would have to navigate alone, and his role was to be there to support her when she needed it, but also to encourage her to develop whatever independence was possible within her new circumstances. "Sophie, my dear, I know it's frustrating not being able to do everything you did before," Michael said in a soft voice, "but you are the bravest and most determined girl I know, and I'm sure we'll find ways for you to achieve anything you want in life." It was that night, after Sophie finally fell asleep in her adapted bed, that Michael made the decision he had been considering for weeks, but had avoided admitting to himself because it meant recognizing that he alone was not enough to give Sophie all the support she needed. Sitting in his office with a cup of cold coffee in his hands, surrounded by financial reports and business proposals that had lost all importance in the face of his daughter's needs, Michael finally admitted to himself that he needed professional help. Sophie needed someone who understood not just her physical needs, but also her emotional and psychological needs. Someone trained to help children with disabilities develop confidence and independence. Someone who could be there during the day when he was working, and who could offer the kind of specialized support that he, despite all his love and resources, was not qualified to provide. The decision wasn't easy, because it represented admitting his own limitations as a father, something that went against all the protective instincts he had developed since Sophie's birth. But he knew that his daughter's well-being had to come before his own pride. He opened his laptop and began researching specialized caregivers, nannies with special needs training, physical therapists who also offered companionship services, any professional who could offer Sophie the kind of specialized care and understanding she deserved. After hours of research and several phone calls to specialized agencies, Michael began drafting an advertisement that would be published in the country's best communication vehicles. "I need professional help to care for Sophie, someone who understands her special needs," Michael murmured to himself as he typed. "She deserves to have someone qualified by her side, someone who can help her flourish despite all adversities." The advertisement that Michael finally published was carefully crafted to attract qualified candidates, but also to make it clear that he was looking for much more than just an ordinary nanny. He needed someone who could be a companion, teacher, therapist, and friend to Sophie, all while maintaining the professionalism and high standards he demanded in all aspects of his life. Seeking nanny for special child. Experience necessary with physically disabled children. Premium salary for qualified candidate. Loving family environment. References essential. Full-time dedication. The words were direct and practical, but behind each phrase was the desperate love of a father who would do anything to ensure his daughter had the best possible quality of life. Michael knew he was offering not just a job, but an opportunity for someone special to make a real difference in the life of a child who had faced more challenges. The small two-bedroom house on the outskirts of the city seemed to embrace Sarah with its old furniture and peeling walls that told the story of decades of simple but dignified life. Sarah Wilson, a 24-year-old young woman with brown hair tied in a messy ponytail and dark eyes that shone with determination, was sitting at the wooden kitchen table, surrounded by thick physiotherapy books, photocopied handouts, and handwritten notes that covered every inch of the available surface. The yellowish light from the lamp hanging over the table cast dancing shadows on the open pages as she studied spinal cord anatomy, a complex subject that required hours of memorization and deep understanding of the neurological mechanisms that controlled human movement. Her delicate but strong hands, calloused from caring for her elderly parents and from part-time jobs she took to pay for college, moved quickly through the pages as she made notes with a pen that was almost out of ink. The clock on the kitchen wall showed almost 2 in the morning, but Sarah knew she still had at least 3 hours of study ahead if she wanted to be prepared for next week's neuroanatomy exam. In the background, she could hear her father's heavy breathing in the adjacent room, interspersed with her mother's persistent cough that had worsened in recent weeks, constantly reminding her of the responsibility she carried on her young shoulders. If I can get a good grade on this exam, I'll be closer to graduating and being able to help people who really need it, Sarah muttered to herself, turning another page of the book. Each night of study is an investment in the future. I want to build for my family and for the patients I'll care for. The sound of her mother's cough intensified in the next room, causing Sarah to raise her head from the books and look worriedly toward the narrow corridor that led to the 2 small bedrooms of the house. Donna Mary, a 62-year-old woman who had worked her entire life as a cleaning lady to support the family, was now confined to bed most of the time due to respiratory problems that had developed after years of exposure to cleaning chemicals without adequate protection. Her husband, Mr. Charles, 65, suffered from severe arthritis in his hands and knees, the result of decades working as a bricklayer under sun and rain, carrying heavy materials that slowly deteriorated his joints to the point where he could barely get out of bed on his own in the morning. Sarah had taken on the role of primary caregiver for both parents since she began physical therapy college 3 years earlier, administering medications, helping with personal hygiene, preparing meals adapted to each one's medical needs, and doing basic physical therapy with her father to maintain his limited mobility. It was a daily cycle that began at 5 in the morning and ended only when she finally managed to sit down to study, usually after midnight, when her parents were asleep and the house was quiet enough to allow concentration. Her mother's weak voice echoed down the hallway, interrupting Sarah's thoughts and calling her for another of the nighttime consultations that had become routine. "Sarah, dear, can you bring some water? The coffee's very strong today and I don't want to wake your father," Donna Mary asked in a hoarse voice. "Daughter, don't worry about us. Focus on your studies, which are more important for your future." Sarah carefully closed the book, marking the page with a piece of paper, and headed to the kitchen to prepare a warm tea with honey for her mother, a homemade remedy that offered some temporary relief for the persistent cough that doctors at the health center couldn't completely cure with the limited medications available in the public system. While waiting for the water to boil on the old stove that sometimes failed, Sarah looked around the small but organized kitchen, noticing the bills stacked on top of the refrigerator that needed to be paid, the shopping list on the door that included only essential items, and the bottle of expensive medication on the sink that consumed a large part of the monthly family income. She took the tea to her parents' room, helped her mother sit up in bed and held the cup while she slowly drank, observing how the woman who had been strong and independent her entire life now depended on her for the most basic needs. Back in the kitchen, Sarah resumed her studies, but her mind was divided between the complexities of neural anatomy she needed to memorize and the financial concerns that kept the entire family in a constant state of stress. The money she earned giving private anatomy lessons to college classmates and working as an assistant in a physical therapy clinic on weekends barely covered the basic household expenses, and she knew she would need to find a more substantial source of income if she wanted to continue paying for college and provide better medical care for her parents. "I need to find a way to earn more money without compromising my studies," Sarah thought, absently leafing through the local newspaper someone had left on the table. "There must be an opportunity out there that allows me to use my physiotherapy knowledge and at the same time support my family." It was then that her eyes fixed on an advertisement in the jobs section that seemed to have been written specifically for her, as if the universe had conspired to place exactly what she needed right before her eyes at the right moment. Looking for a nanny for special child, experience necessary with physically disabled children, competitive salary for qualified candidate, loving family environment, references required, full-time dedication. Sarah read the advertisement 3 times, each word gaining more meaning with each reading, her heart racing as she realized this could be the answer to all the problems she had been trying to solve alone for months. She had practical experience with physical rehabilitation through her college internships, had cared for children in previous jobs, and more importantly, intimately understood what it meant to care for someone with physical limitations through her daily experience with her parents. The competitive salary mentioned in the advertisement could solve not only her personal financial difficulties, but also allow her to hire professional caregivers for her parents during the day, giving them the specialized care they deserved while she worked. Sarah took a pen and wrote down the phone number from the advertisement on a separate piece of paper, already imagining what it would be like to work with a child who needed special care and how she could apply everything she had learned in college in a real and meaningful situation. "This could be my chance to help all of us at the same time," Sarah whispered, looking at the advertisement with growing hope. "If I get this job, I can care for a child who needs me and still solve my family's financial problems." The next morning, after a night of interrupted sleep filled with worries and planning, Sarah dressed in her best clothes, a simple but well-ironed white blouse and a navy blue skirt she had bought on sale 2 years before, and headed to the public phone on the corner of her street to call the number in the advertisement. Her hands trembled slightly as she dialed, not just due to the natural nerves of a job interview, but also because she knew that call could completely change the course of her life and her family's life. The voice that answered on the other end was professional yet warm, belonging to an assistant who scheduled an interview for that same afternoon at Michael's mansion, giving Sarah only a few hours to mentally prepare for what could be the most important opportunity of her life. She spent the rest of the morning researching everything she could about caring for children with physical disabilities, reviewing her pediatric physiotherapy notes, and rehearsing answers to questions she imagined might be asked during the interview. The address she had received led her to an upscale neighborhood in the city that she knew only in passing, where the houses were enormous and surrounded by perfectly maintained gardens, a world completely different from the simple reality where she had grown up. When the bus dropped her off at the stop nearest to the mansion, Sarah walked through the tree-lined streets, observing the luxurious residences, each more impressive than the last, trying to imagine what the lives of the families who lived there were like. "Lord, give me strength and wisdom for this interview," Sarah murmured in a silent prayer as she approached the imposing gate. "May I show this family that I have the knowledge and love necessary to care for their daughter." Michael's mansion's electronic gate opened smoothly after Sarah announced her arrival through the intercom, revealing a paved entrance that wound through meticulously planned gardens to a house that looked more like a small palace, with its white columns, large windows, and architecture that demonstrated not just wealth but also good taste and attention to detail. Sarah walked slowly along the entrance, trying not to show how impressed she was with the opulence of the environment, but also observing details that could indicate adaptations for a disabled child. Ramps subtly integrated into the landscaping, elegantly disguised handrails, non-slip flooring that seemed decorative but that she recognized as functional. The main door was opened by a uniformed housekeeper who led her through corridors decorated with expensive art and furniture that seemed to have come from decoration magazines until they reached an elegant office where Michael was waiting for her. He was sitting behind a solid mahogany desk, wearing a perfectly tailored dark suit, but Sarah could see in his eyes the same concern and love that she recognized in herself when she looked at her parents. The expression of someone who would do anything to protect and care for a loved one. The office was impressive, with shelves full of books, windows that offered views of private gardens, and an atmosphere that inspired both respect and intimidation, but Sarah forced herself to focus on the man sitting before her, not the luxurious environment surrounding them. "Good afternoon, Mr. Michael. I'm Sarah Wilson, and I'm here for the caregiver position interview," Sarah said with a clear voice, confidently extending her hand. "Thank you for the opportunity to meet you and learn more about how I can help your family." Michael stood up to greet her, and Sarah could immediately see that he was a man who took fatherhood very seriously. There was an intensity in his dark eyes that spoke of deep love, but also of fierce protection and extremely high standards for anyone who might be involved in his daughter's life. He invited her to sit in a comfortable leather armchair in front of his desk, and for a few minutes, They exchanged basic courtesies while he reviewed the resume she had submitted, but Sarah could feel that the real interview had not yet begun. When Michael finally looked up from the papers and focused fully on her, Sarah felt as if she was being evaluated not just professionally, but as a person, as if he was trying to look directly into her soul to determine if she was trustworthy with the most precious asset of his life. The questions started technical: her experience with physiotherapy, knowledge about different types of physical disabilities, familiarity with adaptive equipment, but gradually became more personal, exploring her motivations, her patience, her ability to handle frustration and emotional challenges. Sarah answered each question with honesty and competence, sharing specific examples from her experience caring for her parents and patients during her internships, but also letting show the genuine passion she felt for helping people facing physical challenges. The conversation flowed naturally, and Sarah could perceive that Michael was gradually relaxing, his body language becoming less formal as he began to see in her not just a job candidate, but a person who genuinely cared. "Sarah, Sophie is everything to me, and she needs specialized care and a lot of patience," Michael said, his voice laden with paternal emotion. "I cannot afford to make a mistake in choosing who will take care of her when I'm not present." Sarah felt the weight of responsibility in these words, but instead of intimidating her, they awakened in her an even greater determination to prove she was the right person for that vital role. She leaned slightly forward in her chair, maintaining direct eye contact with Michael, as she responded with a sincerity that came straight from the heart, speaking not just as a qualified professional, but as someone who deeply understood what it meant to love and care for a vulnerable person. "Mr. Michael, I completely understand your concern, and I can assure you that I have both the technical knowledge in physiotherapy and rehabilitation and the genuine love for children that are necessary for this position," Sarah responded with growing conviction. "I've cared for my elderly parents for years, helping with limited mobility, managing complex medications and providing not just physical care, but also emotional support during difficult times. I know that each child is unique, especially those facing physical challenges, and I promise that I will study and learn everything about Sophie's specific needs so I can offer her the best possible care. More than that, I promise to treat her not as a patient or a job, but as if she were my own sister with all the love, patience, and dedication that an older sister would give. I understand that trust needs to be earned, and I am prepared to prove every day that I am worthy of the responsibility of caring for the most precious thing in your life." The intensity and sincerity in Sarah's voice clearly touched Michael, who remained silent for a few moments, studying her face as if trying to read her soul through her dark and determined eyes. Sarah could see that he was processing not just her words, but the energy and conviction behind them, evaluating whether she truly understood the magnitude of the responsibility she was taking on. The office fell silent except for the soft tick-tock of an antique clock on the shelf, and Sarah used these moments to send a silent prayer, asking that Michael could see in her heart the same thing she knew to be true, that she was genuinely committed to making a difference in Sophie's life, not just as a job opportunity, but as a personal calling. When Michael finally spoke again, his voice had acquired a slightly warmer tone, suggesting that her words had resonated with him in a way he hadn't expected. "Sarah, I can see that you're sincere in your intentions, and your experience with physiotherapy is certainly relevant to Sophie's needs," Michael said, leaning back in his chair. "But I need you to understand that Sophie has been through a traumatic experience that completely changed her life, and she's still adapting to her new reality. There will be difficult days, moments of frustration, and situations that will require not just technical competence, but also almost infinite patience and an ability to maintain hope, even when she herself may be losing hope. Are you prepared for that level of emotional commitment?" Sarah didn't hesitate for even a second before answering, her voice firm and full of a conviction that came from years of personal experience caring for people she loved during their most vulnerable moments. "Mr. Michael, I can say with absolute certainty that I am not only prepared, but eager to take on this emotional commitment," she replied, her hands gesturing gently as she spoke. "For the past 3 years, I have been the primary caregiver for my parents, who face significant physical limitations due to age and health issues. I've seen my father, who used to be a strong and independent man, struggle to accept that he needed help with basic tasks. I've seen my mother cry from frustration when her labored breathing prevented her from doing the simple things she always did. I've learned that caring for someone with physical limitations isn't just about medical techniques or rehabilitation exercises. It's about understanding that some days will be about celebrating small victories, other days will be about simply being present during difficult moments, and every day will be about keeping alive the hope and dignity of the person you're caring for. I promise you that I will care for Sophie with the same unconditional love that I have for my own parents, and that I will do everything in my power to help her not just adapt to her circumstances, but to flourish and discover all the wonderful things she can still do and be. The expression on Michael's face visibly changed during Sarah's speech, moving from professional caution to something closer to genuine hope, as if he had found in her words exactly what he was looking for without knowing how to articulate it. He rose from his chair and walked to the large window that offered a view of the gardens, standing with his back to Sarah for a few moments as he processed the decision he was about to make. Sarah remained seated, observing his body language and feeling that the moment of decision had arrived, her heart beating rapidly as she waited to know if her life was about to completely change. When Michael turned back to her, there was a resolution in his eyes that wasn't there at the beginning of the interview, and Sarah could feel that something had fundamentally changed in the dynamic between them. "Sarah, I'm going to be straight with you," Michael said, returning to his chair and leaning forward with his hands clasped on the desk. "I've interviewed several candidates in the past few weeks, all with impressive credentials and relevant experience, but none of them gave me the confidence that they truly understand what Sophie needs at a deeper level. You are the first person who talks about caring for her, not as a technical job, but as a genuine emotional commitment. This tells me that you see Sophie as a complete person, not just as a child with a disability, and that's exactly the kind of perspective she needs in her life right now." Sarah felt a wave of relief and gratitude sweep through her body, but Michael raised a hand indicating that he wasn't finished speaking yet, and she forced herself to remain focused as he continued to explain his expectations and the reality of the position. "I want to offer you the position, but I need you to understand exactly what it entails," Michael continued, his voice taking on a more formal tone again. "You will be responsible for Sophie from 8 in the morning until 6 in the evening, Monday through Friday, with the possibility of some evenings and weekends when I need to travel on business. Your responsibilities will include accompanying her to physiotherapy sessions, helping with daily activities, assisting with homework, and most importantly, being a positive and encouraging companion during the ongoing adaptation process. The salary is 3 times higher than the market standard for similar positions, because I recognize that I'm asking for much more than basic care. There will be a 1-month trial period, during which I will observe how you and Sophie relate to each other, and if all goes well, I will offer a long-term contract with additional benefits, including health insurance and continuing education opportunities in pediatric physiotherapy. Are you willing to accept these terms?" Sarah could hardly believe what she was hearing. Not only was the salary more than enough to solve all her family's financial problems, but Michael was also offering professional growth opportunities that would help her become an even better physiotherapist. "Mr. Michael, I accept all the terms you've presented, and I want to assure you that I will do my best to honor the trust you're placing in me," Sarah responded, barely able to contain the emotion in her voice. "When can I meet Sophie and start working with her?" Michael smiled for the first time since the beginning of the interview, a genuine smile that completely transformed his expression and revealed the loving father behind the facade of the strict businessman. He stood up and extended his hand to Sarah, who shook it firmly, sealing an agreement that both knew would be much more than a simple professional relationship. "So you start tomorrow at 8 in the morning," Michael said, his voice carrying a mixture of relief and expectation. "I'll spend the next 2 hours showing you the house, explaining Sophie's daily routine, and introducing you to the equipment and adaptations we have here. I also want you to meet Sophie today, so that tomorrow won't be a complete shock for her to have a new person in her life. She's a smart and resilient girl, but she's also cautious with strangers since the accident, So I need you to be patient while she gets used to your presence." Michael paused for a moment, his tone becoming more serious and laden with paternal emotion. "Sarah, I want you to always remember one thing. Sophie is literally my reason for living. Every decision I make, every business I close, every breath I take is for her. I trust that you understand the weight of this responsibility and that you will honor the trust I am placing in you. If you ever feel that you cannot give her the care and love she deserves, I want you to tell me immediately, because her well-being comes before any other consideration." Sarah nodded solemnly, completely understanding the depth of love and protection that Michael felt for his daughter, and feeling honored to be chosen to be part of the life of a family that clearly loved each other deeply despite the challenges they faced. 3 weeks had passed since Sarah began working at Michael's mansion, and the daily routine had established itself as a carefully choreographed dance between caregiver and child. Sophie's room had been transformed into a small adapted paradise, with soft rugs spread across the floor where she could play comfortably, low shelves filled with books and toys within reach of her hands, and physiotherapy equipment discreetly integrated into the decor so that they didn't look medical or intimidating. Sarah had spent hours studying every detail of Sophie's routine, learning her preferences, her fears, her moments of frustration, and her small joys, slowly building a relationship of trust that went far beyond a simple professional relationship between caregiver and patient. On that sunny Thursday afternoon, they were sitting on the fluffy rug in front of the large window that offered a view of the gardens, surrounded by dolls, coloring books, and puzzle games that Sarah had brought specially chosen to stimulate both Sophie's motor coordination and concentration. The girl was particularly excited that day, laughing with a spontaneity that Sarah had learned to value as a sign that Sophie was having one of her good days, precious moments when the reality of her condition seemed temporarily forgotten in favor of the simple joy of being an 8-year-old child playing with someone who genuinely cared about her. Sarah observed each of Sophie's facial expressions, each gesture, each word, not just as an attentive caregiver, but as someone who had become deeply invested in the girl's emotional and physical well-being. "Sarah, do you think one day I'll be able to play hide-and-seek like other children do running?" Sophie asked with innocent curiosity, organizing her dolls in rows. "Sometimes I dream that I'm running through gardens, and when I wake up I feel sad because it was just a dream." Sarah felt her heart tighten at Sophie's question, but she had learned in recent weeks that gentle honesty was always the best approach with such an intelligent and perceptive child. She moved closer to Sophie on the rug, organizing some books while carefully choosing her words to offer realistic hope without creating unrealistic expectations that could lead to later disappointment. "Sophie, dear, there are many different ways to play hide-and-seek, and some of them you can already do perfectly well," Sarah responded affectionately, picking up one of the dolls and beginning to comb its hair. "For example, we can play hide-and-seek where you hide objects around the house and I have to find them, or you can hide behind furniture and curtains while I look for you. What's important isn't how you move, but how you use your intelligence and creativity to make the game fun." Sarah paused for a moment, observing how Sophie processed her words and continued with genuine enthusiasm. "And who knows? Medicine is always discovering new things, so we should never lose hope completely. But in the meantime, let's focus on all the wonderful things you can already do and on discovering new ways to have fun that perhaps other children haven't even thought of yet." Sophie smiled at this response, and Sarah could see that she had achieved the right balance between realism and optimism that the girl needed to hear. "You always know the right things to tell me, Sarah. Daddy sometimes gets so sad when I ask questions like this that he can't answer properly," Sophie observed with surprising maturity for her age. "I like that you don't pretend everything will be the same as before, but you also don't act like I'm broken and can't do anything cool." It was during this intimate and meaningful conversation that Sarah noticed something that made her heart almost stop beating for a moment. While Sophie was distracted arranging her dolls and talking about her dreams, Sarah observed an almost imperceptible movement in the girl's right foot. The toes contracted slightly, a subtle movement that lasted only a few seconds, but was definitely intentional and not just a random muscle spasm. Sarah forced herself to maintain a neutral expression and continue the conversation normally, but her eyes remained fixed on Sophie's foot, waiting to see if the movement would repeat itself, her heart racing as she tried to process what she had just witnessed. As a physiotherapy student, she knew that involuntary movements were common in cases of spinal cord injury, but something about what she had seen seemed different, more controlled, more responsive to what Sophie was thinking or feeling at the moment. Sarah continued watching discreetly while maintaining the conversation, pretending to be completely absorbed in the dolls she was organizing, but in reality, every fiber of her attention was focused on Sophie's lower limbs, looking for any additional sign of neural activity that could confirm her suspicions. A few minutes later, when Sophie leaned over to grab a book that was slightly out of reach, Sarah clearly saw the toes of the right foot move again, this time more pronouncedly, as if Sophie was unconsciously trying to use her feet to propel herself, a natural reflex suggesting that the neural connections weren't completely severed as everyone had assumed. "Sophie, dear, can you pass me that blue book that's near your foot?" Sarah asked casually, wanting to test if there was a correlation between the movements and Sophie's awareness of her lower limbs. "I want to see if we can find a story about children who discover special talents they didn't know they had." Sophie turned to grab the book, and at that moment Sarah witnessed something that left her completely breathless. She clearly saw not just the toes moving, but Sophie's entire right foot making a small flexion, as if she were trying to use the muscles in her leg to help reach the book. The movement was brief, and Sophie was clearly unaware that it had happened. But to Sarah, who had studied neurology and knew exactly what to look for, it was undeniable evidence that there was neural activity in Sophie's legs that medical examinations hadn't detected. Sarah felt a mixture of excitement and terror running through her veins. Excitement at the possibility that Sophie might have more neural function than anyone imagined, but terror at the responsibility of witnessing something that could completely change the girl's diagnosis and future. She knew she needed to document and report what she had seen, but she also knew she needed to be absolutely certain before creating false hope in Michael, who had already gone through so much suffering and disappointment. Sarah forced herself to continue playing normally with Sophie, but mentally, she was cataloguing every detail of what she had observed, preparing herself for the moment when she would have to decide if and how to share this information with Michael. "Sophie, did you feel anything different just now when you leaned over to get the book? Any tingling or strange sensation in your legs?" Sarah asked in a carefully casual voice, trying not to reveal the intensity of her curiosity. "Sometimes our body does things we don't even notice, and it can be interesting to pay attention to these small sensations." Sophie stopped flipping through the book and looked at Sarah with a thoughtful expression, as if she were trying to identify some sensation that she might have ignored or not fully understood. "Now that you mention it, sometimes I feel like my legs want to move, especially when I'm concentrating on doing something or when I'm dreaming," Sophie replied slowly, touching her legs with her hands as if trying to awaken some sensation. "But doctor, Williams said that was normal, that it was just my brain trying to send signals to places that can no longer receive the messages. He called it, what was it again? Phantom sensations." Sarah felt her heart beat even faster with this revelation. If Sophie was experiencing phantom sensations, this could indicate that there was more neural activity happening than the exams had detected, especially if these sensations were correlated with actual physical movements like the ones she had just witnessed. "That's very interesting, Sophie. Could you tell me more about these sensations? When do they happen most frequently? Do you feel them more in one leg than the other?" Sarah asked, trying to maintain her scientific but gentle tone. Sophie put the book aside and concentrated on her legs, as if trying to feel something at that specific moment. "It's more in the right leg, and it usually happens when I'm very focused or happy, like when I'm playing with you or when Daddy is telling me stories at night. It's like they want to join in the fun, too." Sarah had to control a wave of emotion that threatened to prematurely reveal her suspicions. "Sophie, would you mind if I talk to your father about these sensations you're having? I think it might be important for the doctors to know about this," Sarah said carefully. "It's nothing to worry about, but the more information adults have about how you're feeling, the better they can take care of you." At that exact moment, as if the universe had conspired to create the perfect moment, Sarah saw something that made her react instinctively without thinking about the consequences. While Sophie was speaking and gesturing animatedly about her sensations, her right foot visibly moved, flexing and extending her toes in a way that was impossible to ignore or explain as an involuntary spasm. The movement was clear, defined, and lasted several seconds, long enough for Sarah to be absolutely certain of what she was seeing. Unable to contain herself, Sarah jumped up from the carpet with an energy that startled Sophie, who immediately asked what had happened. "Sophie, I need you to stay exactly where you are and not move while I call your father," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice calm but clearly agitated. "You just did something very important, and I need your father to see this too." Sarah ran to the bedroom door, knowing that Michael was in his office downstairs, probably working on his computers as he did every afternoon. She ran down the stairs, almost tripping in her haste, and burst into Michael's office without knocking, something she had never done before, but which the urgency of the moment completely justified. Michael looked up from his papers, clearly surprised by Sarah's dramatic entrance, but when he saw the expression on her face, he immediately realized that something significant had happened. "Mr. Michael, you need to come to Sophie's room immediately. She moved her feet. I saw it clearly. It wasn't a spasm or involuntary reflex. It was a real controlled movement," Sarah exclaimed, almost breathless from running and adrenaline. "I know it seems impossible, but I swear I saw her toes move intentionally several times in the last few minutes." Michael stood paralyzed for a few seconds, processing Sarah's words as if they had been spoken in a foreign language, his mind struggling to accept the possibility that something that had been declared medically impossible could be happening in his own home. He got up from his chair so abruptly that he knocked some papers to the floor, but completely ignored the mess as he quickly headed for the door, followed closely by Sarah, who was trying to explain exactly what she had witnessed. "Sarah, are you absolutely sure about what you saw? Couldn't it have been just a muscle reflex or something that seemed like movement, but was actually something else?" Michael asked as he climbed the stairs 2 steps at a time, his voice mixing desperate hope with fear of being disappointed again. "I need you to be 100% certain, because I can't go through another false hope, especially not when it comes to Sophie." Sarah kept pace beside him, her certainty unwavering despite the pressure of the situation. "Mr. Michael, I studied neurology and physiotherapy for 3 years. I know the difference between involuntary reflexes and intentional movement. What I saw was definitely controlled movement, coordinated with what Sophie was thinking and doing at the moment. She wasn't aware it was happening, but there was a clear correlation between her mental activity and the movement of her feet." They arrived at Sophie's room, who was still sitting on the rug exactly where Sarah had left her, looking confused at the commotion her situation had caused. "Daddy, why are you running?" "Sarah said I did something important, but I didn't do anything different than I always do," Sophie said innocently. "I'm starting to worry that maybe I did something wrong without realizing it." Michael knelt on the rug beside Sophie, trying to control his breathing and maintain a calm expression so as not to alarm her, but Sarah could see in his eyes the intensity of hope and fear that were waging a battle within him. "Sophie, dear, you didn't do anything wrong. Sarah thinks she saw your feet move, and we want to check if that's true," Michael explained in a soft voice, gently placing his hands on Sophie's shoulders. "I'm going to touch your feet and legs, and I want you to tell me if you feel anything, okay?" Sarah positioned herself where she could clearly observe Sophie's legs, her trained eyes looking for any sign of movement, as Michael began to carefully examine his daughter's feet and ankles. For several minutes there was no visible movement, and Sarah began to feel a twinge of doubt about what she had seen, questioning if perhaps her own hope had influenced her perception. But then, when Michael touched the sole of Sophie's right foot and asked if she could feel anything, Sarah clearly saw the toes contract slightly, a movement that lasted only a few seconds but was undeniably real. "There, did you see that?" Chandra exclaimed, pointing to Sophie's foot. "Her toes moved when you touched the sole of her foot." Michael had felt the contraction too, and his expression instantly changed from cautious to euphoric, as if a miracle had just happened before his eyes. "Sophie, did you feel when I touched your foot just now?" Michael asked with a voice trembling with emotion. Did you manage to move your toes on purpose, or did it happen without you realizing it? Sophie looked down at her feet with an expression of intense concentration, as if she were trying to connect some vague sensation she had felt with the movement the adults were describing. I felt something when you touched my foot, Daddy. It wasn't like feeling normally, but it was like someone was whispering to my leg that you were there, Sophie said, choosing her words carefully. And when you talk about my toes moving, it's like I can almost remember having told them to move, but I'm not sure if it really happened or if I'm imagining it. Michael looked at Sarah with an expression that mixed deep gratitude and an urgency that she immediately recognized. Sarah, you were right. There's something happening here that the doctors didn't detect. We need to take Sophie to the hospital immediately for new tests, Michael said, already getting up and heading to the closet where he kept Sophie's portable wheelchair. If there is indeed neural activity that the first exams didn't capture, every minute could be important for treatment. Sarah felt vindicated, but also extremely responsible for what she had set in motion. She knew she was potentially changing the course of Sophie and Michael's lives with her observations, and silently prayed that she was right about what she had seen. Mr. Michael, I want to go with you to the hospital if you'll allow it. I can explain to the doctors exactly what I observed, the specific moments when the movements happened, and help provide information that may be crucial for new tests, Sarah said, grabbing the emergency bag that Michael always kept prepared. I am absolutely certain of what I saw, and I will repeat that to any doctor who questions my observation. The trip to the hospital was a surreal mixture of renewed hope and extreme anxiety, with Michael driving faster than was safe while Sarah held Sophie's hand in the back seat, continuously observing her legs for any additional sign of movement. Sophie, who was initially confused about why everyone was so agitated, began to grasp the importance of what was happening and fell quiet, also watching her own feet as if expecting them to do something dramatic. During the journey, Sarah recalled aloud every detail of what she had observed, the specific moments when the movements occurred, the correlation with Sophie's emotional and mental state, the difference between what she had seen and typical involuntary reflexes, creating a detailed medical narrative that could be useful for the doctors who would examine Sophie. Michael asked occasional questions, clarifying details and trying to fully understand what Sarah had observed, but Sarah could see that he was struggling between allowing himself to hope and protecting himself from possible disappointment. When they arrived at the hospital, Michael went straight to the emergency reception, demanding that Sophie be seen immediately by Dr. Williams or another senior neurologist, his voice carrying an authority that came from both his social position and his desperate need for answers. Sarah stayed beside Sophie, explaining in simple but honest terms what might happen during the examinations, keeping her calm and prepared for what could be a long and potentially frustrating afternoon of medical tests. Sophie, the doctors will do some tests to see if your feet can really move like Sarah saw happening, Michael explained while they waited to be called. No matter what they discover, you're still my brave and special girl, and nothing will change that. Dr. Williams arrived within an hour, clearly intrigued by Michael's urgent report about possible neural activity that had been missed in the initial examinations. Sarah explained her observations with scientific precision, describing not only what she had seen, but also the medical context that made her observations significant, impressing the doctor with her knowledge and attention to detail. Sophie underwent a series of neurological tests, more detailed than the initial ones, including electrical nerve stimulation, high-resolution magnetic resonance imaging, and reflex tests that went far beyond the scope of standard examinations for spinal cord injury. Sarah and Michael watched anxiously as the technicians conducted each test, looking for any sign on the faces of the medical professionals that might indicate whether they were finding something significant or if Sarah's hopes would once again be frustrated by the brutal medical reality. After 3 hours of intensive testing, Dr. Williams finally returned with the results, his expression completely neutral and professional in a way that revealed nothing about what he was about to communicate. Michael held Sarah's hand tightly, and she could feel his hands trembling slightly as they waited for the verdict that could change their lives or confirm that their hopes were unfounded. Dr. Williams, please tell us what the tests showed. Sarah was absolutely certain of what she saw, and I myself felt movement in Sophie's feet, Michael said, his voice controlled but clearly tense. "We need to know if there is any possibility that the initial diagnosis was incomplete or incorrect in some way." Dr. Williams sat before them with the same grave expression he had used months earlier when he first explained Sophie's injury, and Sarah felt her stomach tighten as she prepared to hear that her observations had been incorrect or misinterpreted. "I'm sorry to say this, but today's tests completely confirm the original diagnosis," the doctor said in a gentle but firm voice. "There is no evidence of neural activity in Sophie's lower extremities. The new nerve conduction tests, magnetic resonance imaging, and all reflex examinations show complete spinal cord injury at the level we originally identified. It is impossible that she moved in the way that was described." The words hit Sarah like a physical punch, making her question not only her perception, but her professional competence and her ability to distinguish between reality and wishful thinking. Michael turned to her with an expression that mixed deep disappointment with something that could have been anger, though Sarah hoped it was just frustration directed at the situation rather than at her personally. "Sarah, you gave me false hope about my daughter. I trusted you, and you made me believe something miraculous was happening when in fact there was nothing," Michael said, his voice low but loaded with painful emotion. "How could you be so certain about something that apparently never really happened?" Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes, but forced herself to maintain composure while processing the possibility that she had made a terrible mistake that caused unnecessary suffering for a family that had already been through so much. But even facing medical authority and Michael's disappointment, something deep inside her refused to accept that her observations had been completely incorrect. "Mr. Michael, I completely understand your disappointment, and if I was wrong about what I saw, I take full responsibility for having created false hopes," Sarah said, her voice trembling but determined. "But I need you to know that I didn't imagine what I saw. I observed specific, controlled movements that happened at specific moments correlated with Sophie's mental activity. It may be that the current tests aren't sensitive enough to detect the type of neural activity I witnessed, or there may be something happening that medicine doesn't yet fully understand." Sarah paused, looking directly into Michael's eyes with a conviction that came from the depths of her soul. "I know it seems impossible to contradict conclusive medical exams, but I know what I saw. There is something the tests aren't detecting, and I beg you not to give up looking for answers just because the first tests didn't confirm my observations." The silence that followed was loaded with tension, with Michael clearly struggling between trusting the woman who had become important in his daughter's life and accepting the medical verdict that confirmed his worst fears about false hopes. "If I'm wrong, I accept the consequences, but if I'm right, Sophie may be losing a chance at recovery because we stopped looking for answers too soon." The nights at the Physical Therapy College Library became Sarah's refuge in the 2 weeks following the devastating confrontation at the hospital. Sitting among piles of medical books and printed scientific articles, she obsessively scoured every study on spinal cord injuries, neural regeneration, and experimental therapies, determined to find some explanation for what she had witnessed in Sophie's room. The library remained open until late hours for graduate students, and Sarah took advantage of every available minute. Her eyes red from fatigue, scanning page after page of complex medical terminology while searching for any precedent that could validate her observations. Michael had become cold and distant since the episode at the hospital, treating her with the minimum professional courtesy necessary, but Sarah could feel that his trust had been severely shaken. The tension in the mansion was palpable, and even Sophie had noticed the change in dynamics between the adults, frequently asking why Daddy and Sarah no longer talked like before. "If I can find scientific evidence that supports what I saw, perhaps Michael can forgive me for the disappointment I caused," Sarah thought, as she turned another page of a neurological journal. "There has to be some medical explanation for those movements I witnessed with my own eyes." It was during one of these late-night intensive research sessions that Sarah discovered an article buried in an obscure medical journal that completely changed her perspective on Sophie's situation. The study, conducted by a team of neurologists in Europe, described rare cases of patients with spinal cord injuries who presented temporary neural stimulation, a condition where apparently severed neural connections could be temporarily reactivated through specific techniques of electrical stimulation and targeted physical manipulation. The article explained that in some cases, the nerve fibers were not completely destroyed, but rather dormant due to trauma, and that experimental reactivation protocols had shown promising results in a small percentage of patients. Sarah read and reread the article multiple times, her heart racing as she understood that the symptoms described in the study were almost identical to what she had observed in Sophie. Subtle movements correlated with mental activity, phantom sensations at specific moments, and reflexes that appeared and disappeared inconsistently. The protocol described was risky and required rigorous medical supervision, but the possibility of success was enough to reignite Sarah's hope. This study describes exactly what I've observed in Sophie. The intermittent movements, the sensations correlated with concentration, Sarah muttered to herself, marking important passages with a yellow highlighter. If this protocol worked with other patients, it could be the key to helping Sophie regain mobility that doctors believe is lost forever. Armed with knowledge from the scientific article and a renewed conviction about her original observations, Sarah decided she needed to confront Michael once more, even risking her position in the family and the possibility of being permanently banned from Sophie's life. The next morning, she waited until Sophie was busy with her online classes on the adapted computer and headed to Michael's office, knocking on the door with determination that masked the nerves she felt inside. Michael invited her in with an expression that clearly showed he wasn't interested in revisiting the embarrassing situation they had experienced at the hospital. But Sarah knew this was her only chance to present evidence that could change everything. "Mr. Michael, I know our last conversation about Sophie's movements was disappointing, but I've discovered something that could completely change our understanding of her condition," Sarah began, placing the printed article on the desk. "There is a medical study published by European neurologists that describes exactly the type of neural activity I observed in Sophie, and more importantly, presents a treatment protocol that has already helped other patients with similar injuries." Michael barely looked at the paper, his expression remaining skeptical and slightly irritated. "Sarah, we've been through this. The best doctors in the country confirmed that Sophie has no neural activity in her legs. I won't subject my daughter to more false hopes based on articles you found on the internet." "Sir, your daughter is not paralytic in the complete sense of the word. I know how to cure her," Sarah exclaimed passionately, knowing her words sounded impossible, but unable to contain the conviction she felt. "This isn't a random article from the internet. It's a peer-reviewed study published by respected neurosurgeons who developed a specific technique for cases exactly like Sophie's." Michael's reaction was explosive and immediate, his patience finally reaching its limit after weeks of accumulated tension since the hospital episode. He rose abruptly from his chair, resting his hands on the desk and leaning toward Sarah with an intensity she had never seen before, his dark eyes shining with a mixture of anger and pain that made her instinctively step back. "Enough, Sarah. You've already deluded me once with your observations that doctors proved were wrong," Michael shouted, his voice echoing off the office walls. "I won't allow you to continue filling my head and Sophie's with impossible hopes based on your need to be right about something that was clearly a perceptual error on your part." Sarah tried to interrupt, reaching toward the article that remained untouched on the desk, but Michael continued his emotional outburst without giving her a chance to explain the technical details she had discovered. "Please, Mr. Michael, listen to me for just 5 minutes. There is a specific method described in this study that can reactivate dormant neural connections through targeted stimulation," Sarah pleaded, her voice trembling with urgency and determination. "The symptoms Sophie presents are identical to those described in the protocol, and if I'm right, we're wasting precious time that could make the difference between her regaining mobility or remaining permanently paralyzed." But Michael had gone beyond the point where he was willing to listen to more theories or explanations. His paternal protection activated in full mode against what he perceived as another attempt by Sarah to justify a mistake that had caused unnecessary suffering for the entire family. "I don't want to hear anything more about this. You're fired, Sarah," Michael declared with brutal finality, pointing to the office door. I want you to collect your things and leave my house immediately before you cause more emotional damage to Sophie with your unfounded theories." Sarah's world collapsed in that moment, not just because she was losing the job that had become much more than a source of income, but because she was being forced to separate from Sophie at the moment when she felt she could make the biggest difference in the girl's life. Tears formed in her eyes as she looked at Michael, seeing in him not the cruel man his words suggested, but a desperate father who had been hurt too much and was trying to protect his daughter in the only way he knew how. "Mr. Michael, please don't force me to leave Sophie now. She needs me, and I can help her in a way that no one else understands," Sarah pleaded, her voice breaking with emotion. "I know it seems impossible after what happened at the hospital, but I swear on my own mother's memory that there is a real chance for Sophie to regain mobility if we apply this protocol correctly." But Michael was inflexible, his decision made not just out of anger in the moment, but from a genuine need to protect Sophie from more disappointments that could be even more devastating than the current situation. Sarah knew there was nothing more she could say to change his mind at that moment, but as she headed for the door, a dangerous determination began to form in her heart. If she couldn't convince Michael to let her try to help Sophie officially, perhaps there was a way to apply the protocol without his approval. "If I leave now, Sophie may forever lose the chance to walk again, and I will never forgive myself for not having tried when I knew there was a possibility," Sarah thought, as she climbed the stairs to say goodbye to Sophie. "Maybe there's a way to apply the neural stimulation technique without Michael knowing, at least to confirm if my theory is correct." The farewell to Sophie was more painful than Sarah had anticipated, especially because she couldn't fully explain why she was leaving without creating more emotional confusion for a child who had already been through enough trauma. Sophie cried and begged Sarah to stay, not understanding why adults were suddenly making drastic changes without consulting her, and Sarah had to use all her emotional strength not to reveal the true reason behind her forced departure. "Sarah, will you come back to visit me? You're the first person since the accident who really understands how I feel," Sophie said through tears, holding Sarah's hand tightly. "I promise I'll try to come back when things calm down between me and your father," Sarah replied, hating herself for making a promise she didn't know if she could keep. Later that night, after the dust had settled in the mansion and Michael had retired to his office to work late as he always did when emotionally disturbed, Sarah made the riskiest decision of her life. She used her emergency key that she had not yet returned to, silently enter the house, moving like a shadow through the familiar corridors until she reached Sophie's room, who was sleeping deeply in her adapted bed. Sarah had spent the hours since her dismissal meticulously studying the protocol described in the article, memorizing each step of the neural stimulation technique and visualizing how to apply it correctly. "If this technique works and Sophie shows real signs of recovery, Michael will have to admit that I was right," Sarah whispered to herself as she approached the bed. "And if it doesn't work, at least I'll know that I tried everything possible to help a child who has become like a sister to me." Sarah gently awakened Sophie, explaining in a low voice that she wanted to try something that could help her legs get better, asking her to trust her one last time, even if it was a secret that she couldn't tell Daddy yet. Sophie, still sleepy but always willing to trust Sarah, agreed to let her apply what she described as a special massage that could make her legs remember how to move again. Sarah carefully positioned her hands at the specific points described in the protocol, along Sophie's spine, on the hip joints, and at specific pressure points that the study indicated as crucial for stimulating dormant neural connections. Following meticulously the instructions she had memorized, Sarah began to apply directed pressure and circular movements that were designed to send natural electrical signals through neural pathways that doctors believed to be permanently damaged. Initially, Sophie simply reported a sensation of warmth and relaxation, as if she were receiving a normal therapeutic massage, but after a few minutes of continued stimulation, she began to feel something different and unexpected. "Sarah, it's starting to tingle in my legs, like when my foot falls asleep, but not exactly the same," Sophie whispered, her eyes widening with curiosity. "Is it a good or bad feeling? Do you want me to stop?" Sarah asked, carefully monitoring Sophie's reaction while continuing to apply the technique. "Don't stop yet. It's like my legs are waking up from a very long sleep," Sophie responded with growing excitement. Sarah, I think I can feel your fingers touching my skin. Is this normal or does it mean something special? The tingling in Sophie's legs gradually intensified as Sarah continued applying the stimulation technique, and for a few wonderful moments, it seemed that the protocol was working exactly as described in the European study. Sophie reported increasingly distinct sensations, describing not just the tingling, but also a feeling of electricity running through her legs in a way she hadn't experienced since before the accident. Sarah felt justified and hopeful, believing that she was finally proving that her original observations had been correct, and that there was indeed neural activity that conventional exams hadn't detected. But then, without warning, something went terribly wrong. The gentle tingling that Sophie had described as pleasant suddenly transformed into something much more intense and frightening, causing her to scream in pain and surprise as her legs began to shake uncontrollably. Sarah immediately stopped the stimulation, but the tremors intensified until they became violent convulsions that shook Sophie's entire body, making the bed shake and alarming Sarah to the point of total panic. "Sarah, what's happening to me? My legs are moving by themselves and I can't stop it," Sophie screamed between convulsions, tears of fear streaming down her face as her body contracted in ways she couldn't control. Sarah desperately tried to calm Sophie and stop the convulsions, applying first aid techniques she had learned in college, but nothing seemed to work, and she began to realize that she had made a terrible mistake that could have consequences far worse than simply losing her job. The convulsions continued for several terrifying minutes before Sophie suddenly went completely still, her eyes closing as she lost consciousness in Sarah's arms, who was now in total panic about what her attempt to help had caused. "Sophie, wake up, please, answer me. I just wanted to help you walk again," Sarah cried, holding Sophie's inert body against her chest. It was exactly at this moment of absolute terror that Michael appeared at the bedroom door, having been alerted by the screams that echoed through the corridors of the mansion until they reached his office on the lower floor. The scene he found, Sarah holding his unconscious daughter with clear evidence that some kind of procedure had been performed without his permission or knowledge, triggered a fury he had never felt before in his life. "What have you done to my daughter?" Michael roared, rushing to the bed and yanking Sophie from Sarah's arms with a force that almost knocked her to the floor. Sarah tried to explain about the neural stimulation protocol and how she was trying to help Sophie when everything went wrong, but Michael was not in an emotional state to listen to technical explanations when his daughter was unconscious and possibly in real medical danger. He picked up his cell phone and dialed emergency services, demanding that an ambulance come immediately for an 8-year-old child who had suffered convulsions and loss of consciousness due to an unauthorized medical procedure. Sarah remained in the room, crying and trying to explain that she had followed a legitimate scientific protocol and that the convulsions were not part of the planned procedure, but Michael completely ignored her while checking Sophie's vital signs and trying to wake her with basic first aid techniques. "Mr. Michael, I never wanted to hurt Sophie. I was just trying to apply a technique that could help her regain mobility," Sarah pleaded through tears. "The seizures were not expected. Something went wrong with the protocol, but I swear my intentions were to help, not to cause harm." When the ambulance arrived and the paramedics took over Sophie's care, Michael turned to Sarah with an expression of anger and disappointment that she knew she would remember for the rest of her life. "You violated my trust in a way that I can never forgive," Michael said in a low voice but loaded with contained fury. "Not only did you disobey my direct order to leave Sophie alone, but you performed some kind of unauthorized medical experiment on my daughter while I wasn't present. If anything happens to Sophie because of what you did tonight, I will ensure that you never work in the medical field again." Sarah knew there were no words that could repair the damage she had caused, not only to Sophie, who was now being carried unconscious into an ambulance, but also to the trust that Michael had placed in her and to her own professional career that might be ruined forever. As she watched the ambulance drive away with flashing lights in the darkness of the night, Sarah realized that her desperate attempt to prove she was right had possibly caused more harm than help, and that she would have to live with the consequences of her impulsive decision for the rest of her life. The last image she had of Michael was of him getting into his own car to follow the ambulance, without looking back once, leaving Sarah alone at the entrance of the mansion, with the full weight of her guilt and regret. What have I done? Instead of helping Sophie, I may have caused permanent damage to the only person who truly mattered to me in this world, Sarah thought, falling to her knees on the cold ground of the entrance. A week had passed since that terrible night, and Sophie remained motionless in the hospital bed, surrounded by machines that monitored every heartbeat, while her small body fought in a state of deep unconsciousness. Michael had not left her bedside, sleeping in the uncomfortable chair, refusing to go home even when friends begged him to rest. His clothes were wrinkled, unshaven, and his red eyes revealed the torment of a father who blamed himself for not protecting his daughter. That afternoon, Michael held Sophie's small, cold hand, whispering words of regret that he hoped she could hear even unconscious. "Forgive Daddy, my princess. I should have protected you better from people who promised impossible miracles," Michael murmured, stroking Sophie's hair. "If you wake up, I promise I will never let anyone experiment on you again, even if they say it's for your own good." Dr. Williams entered the room with an expression of professional compassion, carrying results of more tests he had ordered in the hope of finding signs of improvement in Sophie's neurological state. During the week, he had conducted multiple brain activity tests and reflex monitoring, but the results remained inconclusive about when Sophie would wake from the coma. Michael looked up hopefully when the doctor entered, looking for any sign of good news in the reports, but he had learned to interpret the expressions of medical professionals. "Dr. Williams, is there any change in Sophie's condition?" "Any sign of improvement?" Michael asked in a hoarse voice. The doctor checked the monitors and turned to Michael with compassionate honesty. "Michael, the vital signs remain stable, with no neurological deterioration, which is positive. However, there are no clear signs that she is emerging from the coma," Dr. Williams explained gently. "Unfortunately, we don't know when she will wake up, or if she will wake up with all her faculties intact." "Doctor, she is strong like her mother was. Sophie will fight to come back to me, I'm sure of it," Michael responded, squeezing his daughter's hand. "She has to wake up, because I cannot imagine a world where my daughter is not filling our home with her laughter." It was at that moment that Sarah appeared at the door of the room, her appearance showing that she too had spent the week without sleep, red eyes from crying, evidencing days tormented by guilt. She remained at the doorframe for seconds, gathering courage to face Michael's fury, knowing that her presence could be seen as an additional violation. Sarah carried a folder with research she had obsessively conducted, looking for scientific explanation that offered hope about Sophie's condition. When Michael noticed her presence, his reaction was explosive, all accumulated anger directed at whom he held responsible for the situation. "How dare you show up here after what you did? You have no right to be near Sophie after almost killing her with your crazy experiments," Michael shouted, standing up so quickly he almost knocked over the chair. Sarah took a step inside, hands raised in a pacifying gesture, but determined to communicate what she had discovered. "Mr. Michael, I know my presence seems like an affront, but I need you to listen to me for a few minutes," Sarah pleaded, her voice trembling but determined. "I've spent the week researching the type of coma Sophie is experiencing, and I've discovered something that might change our understanding of what's happening." Michael was about to call security when Sarah continued with an urgency that made him pause. "Mr. Michael, I know it sounds crazy, but the coma Sophie is experiencing isn't the result of neurological damage. It's part of the healing process that the stimulation initiated," Sarah explained quickly, trying to show articles she had found. "I found documented cases of patients who entered temporary comas during accelerated neural regeneration, where the brain shuts down temporarily to allow connections to be rebuilt efficiently." Michael looked at her with incredulity and renewed anger, unable to believe Sarah was still justifying her actions. "You're saying that almost killing my daughter was part of a plan, that putting her in a coma was intentional?" Michael responded with bitter sarcasm. "Sarah, you've lost touch with reality if you believe you can justify this with pseudoscience that no respectable doctor would take seriously. Mr. Michael, Sophie's brain is reconnecting. The brain activity patterns are consistent with active neural regeneration," Sarah insisted. "You almost killed my daughter, and now you come with more crazy theories trying to convince me it was positive." The discussion was escalating when a weak voice interrupted them, making both stop instantly and turn toward the bed where Sophie had opened her eyes for the first time in a week. "Dad." "Stop fighting with Sarah," Sophie said with a hoarse but recognizable voice, blinking slowly while trying to focus on the scene beside her bed. The silence was absolute, with Michael and Sarah paralyzed by the impossibility of Sophie being conscious and aware of what was happening. Michael was the first to move, rushing to the bed and holding Sophie's face in trembling hands, tears of relief streaming down as he looked into the eyes he had feared would never open again. "Sophie, my princess, you're awake." "Daddy was so worried," Michael said between sobs, kissing her forehead repeatedly. Sophie smiled weakly, but her expression changed to surprise and concentration, as if feeling something not experienced for a long time. "Dad, something different is happening. I feel my legs in a way I haven't since the accident," Sophie said slowly, trying to move her limbs under the covers. "So they're tingling, but it's not bad. It's like they're waking up with me after a very long sleep." "Sophie, can you move your toes? Can you try bending your knees?" Sarah asked softly, ignoring Michael's hostile look. Sophie concentrated intensely, tongue appearing between her lips as she always did when focused, and slowly her toes moved under the blanket, followed by deliberate flexing of her right knee that made Michael step back in shock. "I can move. It's not like before, but I can really move my legs when I tell them to," Sophie exclaimed with growing joy, trying to sit up to see better. Sarah had to lean against the wall to avoid fainting from relief, realizing that her theory had become reality, exceeding her most optimistic hopes. Michael was in total shock, looking alternately at Sophie, who continued moving her legs with effort but clear success, and at Sarah, who had risked everything on a medical gamble that had worked against all odds. Dr. Williams, called by the noise, rushed in and began examining Sophie, testing reflexes and motor control with assessments that confirmed what everyone was seeing. "This is medically impossible based on previous exams, but it's happening before our eyes," Dr. Williams muttered while testing Sophie's responses. "I need to do a complete battery of new tests to determine the extent of recovery." "Doctor, how much mobility has Sophie recovered? Will she be able to walk?" Michael asked, alternating between hope and fear of temporary recovery. "I need to know if my daughter had a medical miracle or if this might disappear." Hours later, when tests were completed and analyzed by a team of neurologists summoned to confirm the findings, Dr. Williams returned with an expression of disbelief he couldn't hide. "Michael, Sarah, what we've witnessed defies our understanding of spinal cord injuries and neurological recovery," Dr. Williams began, holding reports that documented a transformation he had never seen before. "The exams show that Sophie has recovered 80% of neural function in her lower extremities. She will be able to walk with some difficulty, but complete paralysis simply no longer exists." Michael had to sit down to process the magnitude of what he was hearing, while Sarah felt overwhelming vindication as she realized that her belief had resulted in something that would benefit Sophie forever. Sophie, listening to the conversation with the seriousness that children demonstrate when they perceive something important happening, spoke with surprising clarity. "Sarah never gave up believing I could get better, even when adults said it was impossible. She listened to me when I said I felt things that nobody believed were real. It's a medical miracle that will change our understanding of spinal cord injuries forever," Dr. Williams concluded, shaking his head. "Sophie, you've become a case that will be studied in medical schools around the world." 6 months later, the mansion's garden was filled with laughter as Sophie carefully walked along the paths, occasionally leaning on an elegant cane, but moving with independence that had seemed impossible. Her gait was deliberate and sometimes awkward, but each step represented victory over prognoses that had declared such recovery impossible. Michael watched from the terrace, his expression radiant with pride as he saw Sophie interact with other children, noting how she had become more compassionate due to the experiences she had faced. Sarah was beside him, no longer as an employee but as a family member, who had earned a permanent place through dedication and courage in risking everything for her convictions. "Sarah, I need to ask forgiveness for having doubted when you most needed support," Michael said, placing his hand on her shoulder. "You saw something in my daughter that none of us could see, and had the courage to act even risking career and reputation. Forgive my distrust, Sarah. You not only saved my daughter, but taught me that miracles happen when someone refuses to accept limitations, Michael responded, taking an envelope from his pocket. I have something that represents my gratitude for what you've done for our family. Michael handed the envelope to Sarah, who opened it with trembling hands and covered her mouth when she saw documents guaranteeing complete payment for her education in physiotherapy, including specialization in pediatric neurology, as well as a fund established for lifelong medical care for her parents. Among the papers, there was also an official letter offering her a permanent position as Sophie's private physiotherapist, with a salary that would allow her to provide total dignity to her family. Michael, this is far more than generous, but I cannot accept something so substantial, Sarah protested, tears running down her face as she held the documents that represented the solution to all the financial problems she had faced for years. Michael firmly refused to take the envelope back, placing his hands over hers in a paternal gesture. Sarah, this isn't a gift based on sentiment. It's an investment in Sophie's future and recognition for your exceptional dedication. Sophie will need specialized physiotherapy for the rest of her life, and I want you to be the most qualified professional possible to continue helping her achieve her full potential. Moreover, your parents sacrificed everything to support your education and deserve the best medical care available. Sarah felt an overwhelming wave of gratitude as she watched Sophie slowly approach, walking with growing confidence despite the cane, carrying a colorful bouquet of flowers she had personally picked from the garden. Thank you for believing in possibilities when I couldn't see beyond the limitations, Michael concluded emotionally, embracing Sarah like the sister she had become to his family. Sophie reached them offering flowers with a radiant smile that illuminated the entire garden, a completely transformed child who had discovered that limits often exist only to be overcome by those brave enough to question them and persist against all odds. Sarah, thank you for never giving up on me, even when I sometimes doubted I could get better, Sophie said with a voice full of love, hugging Sarah's legs with all the strength she could muster. Now, tell me in the comments where you're from. If you like this story, we invite you to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support motivates us to continue bringing emotional stories almost every day. Don't miss the next surprising narrative that's about to appear on your screen. We're immensely grateful to have you here with us. Now, you can click on the links that are appearing on screen right now. We have a special selection just for you, filled with valuable stories and guaranteed entertainment. See you there.